Hello and welcome to episode 44 of the Statesmanship Project. In this episode, I want to discuss assumptions. I was listening to a podcast by Dr. Tom Cowan, and he was talking about the nature of the underlying assumptions within medicine. And the mainstream model bases everything off of assumptions that aren't necessarily true and, in fact, are oftentimes very wrong. And so in this episode, I want to discuss the assumptions in economics. One of the main phrases that is used in economics is assume all other things are equal. So if you're trying to gauge someone's preference between, say, a bagel and a donut, you would assume that their preference for eating them at a particular, or their need to eat at a particular time of day is constant, and that the price of both the donut and the bagel are the same. And so the choice between a donut and a bagel is assumed to be based entirely on their preferences. So it comes down to the fundamental differences between a donut and a bagel and the personal preferences of the consumer. And so by this assumption, economists are able to model an economy, allegedly. And so when you realize that these assumptions aren't necessarily accurate, because very rarely, if ever, are all other things equal, you realize that a lot of modeling in mainstream economics is wrong. One particular assumption I want to address, because it's on my mind, and I think it is very relevant, is the assumption within mostly libertarian circles that money should be something that is assumed to have intrinsic value, such as gold or silver. So a commodity money. Your money should be based off of this. Now, the assumption here is that gold and silver always have value. In reality, they don't. They only have value when a society or civilization or person is civilized enough for them to be used as a means of exchange or a means of adornment, such as jewelry. And so by this means, they can become means of exchange. And in an industrialized society, they represent the productive power of a nation plus the available resources. So a country could be incredibly industrious and have zero gold mines. And so the value of gold would be very minimal unless they needed it in their industrial production. And having gold wouldn't necessarily represent the productive capacity of their nation because they produce other finished goods, like watches, let's say. And so a different nation might be strong in natural resources and have the capacity to mine ounces and ounces and ounces of gold, and then it has a value in representing the productive capacity of their nation. And then they are able to use that in exchange for other goods. What happens is, if you make the assumption that gold is universally valuable, or silver is universally valuable, you diminish the value of the productive capacity of a nation or a person. Because the real source of all value is human labor. It is human productivity. Because gold in the ground represents only potential value. Just as flour in your cupboard represents only potential food. Because you can't really eat raw flour. You have to mix it with labor and water and yeast and sugar and salt. And then you can make bread. Of course, you have to bake it too. The same is true with gold. You must dig it out of the ground. You must purify it. You must mint it. And then you have something valuable. And it is only after that exchange with human value, with human labor, that it becomes valuable. And so we must recognize then that the source of all value is human labor. And while gold and silver can have value, and they have zero counterparty risk, which is true because when you hold an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver. There's no one else that can make a claim on that because it is yours in your possession. What it represents is the productive capacity of a person or of people, because it represents simultaneously the productive power of the people that were necessary in order to make it into that coin. And then it also represents the potential for acquiring more productive power from other people in the future. And so this is where money has value. And if we recognize that, then we can recognize that money itself does not have to be backed by a commodity, because trade can be settled in any sort of commodity, and domestic production can be settled with a domestic currency, and international production, international trade can be settled with various different commodities. And one of the things that we see happen with the internationalization of money, so the fact that the United States dollar is the world reserve currency, we see simultaneously the exportation of jobs. And so first industrial jobs went overseas from the United States because the dollar could be used to purchase industrial jobs in another country versus domestically. And it was easier to print up dollars and buy, it was cheaper to buy labor in another country than it was to buy labor domestically. And then service jobs went overseas because it was also cheaper to use domestic currency to buy international service jobs. This is why when you call the cable company, you get somebody in Bangladesh. And so if your currency is domestic, then your production stays domestic. If the United States dollar was valuable only within the borders of the United States, you wouldn't be able to export jobs, because how are you going to settle an imbalance of trade in service jobs? All of the people in India that work to answer phone calls coming from Americans, how are you going to balance that trade out? Because dollars aren't going to be valuable to those people. They're going to want something else. So what are we going to do? Give them wheat in exchange for answering phone calls? No, at that point it becomes more productive to keep those jobs local. And then it's going to become more productive and more beneficial to keep production jobs local, because you will not be able to exchange your currency for domestic goods abroad, made abroad. So like the goods that are made in China, we will have to give them something other than our currency in exchange for that. And this is where something like gold or silver could become useful in settling international trade. But the paper itself would not have value in their country, with the exception of like tourism exchanges and balances in that regard, because certainly when you go to another country, you're going to want to be able to exchange your currency for their currency, and I'm sure that there would be some sort of annual balance of that trade, such that, you know, we give you back all the Swiss francs that everybody from Switzerland gave us in exchange for dollars, and we'll give you all those back in exchange for the dollars that people gave you, and then perhaps that would balance out. So by understanding this, that domestic currency does not have to be backed by anything other than the productivity of the domestic people, we recognize a way to both safeguard the future productive capacity of our economy, as well as the value of the labor of the members of our nation. We end up with the power to protect the working class by not having international money, because then you don't have international bankers and international financiers. You end up with a domestic currency that is valuable only to the nation, and then you settle international trade through the abundance of productivity that you have within your nation. And then all value within a nation is based solely on the productive capacity of the people within that nation. And so what you see is a fundamental revaluing of both money and human labor. And when we recognize that human labor is the source of all value, that our productivity determines the value of the goods and services within our economy, we recognize that there's no limit to the productive capacity of our nation as long as we, the people, are willing to put in the effort. And then we don't have to worry about economic stagnation. We don't have to worry about economic depressions and recessions. And you recognize that these things are only a result of a limiting of credit in the financial markets. And when your credit is not tied to international productivity, international trade, international balances of trade, and it is not controlled by a foreign financial elite, and it is controlled domestically by people who love their nation and love their people and want them to succeed and want them to have a higher standard of living and want them to be able to fulfill their needs, then you have the key to a successful and higher standard of living and a way of life that actually promotes and respects the goodness and virtue of your people. This is the direction we want to go as a nation, and I hope this makes sense to you, because I would love to see other people talking about this and promoting these ideas. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below, and until next time, have a good day.